Let's talk heavy armour from the grim darkness of the far future, and talk through 8 of the strongest tanks in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Armour of the Dark Millennium, and today I thought it would be fun to take a look at some of the strongest tanks in the game right now, and look through some of the things that make them strong, whether they're guns, durability, or some cool special rules. In general, in Warhammer 40k, tanks have had a few issues in 9th edition. I feel that certainly towards the start of the edition, they were very overcosted for what they did, particularly as they weren't so good for controlling objectives, and generally didn't really have the points efficiency just to sit back and shoot, and could often just be ignored. I feel like a lot of them fell victim to other things getting the core keyword, and all the buffs being able to be targeted to the infantry, and I feel like only now towards the end of the edition, a fair few vehicles are getting a bit more effective now, and there are plenty of heavy armoured vehicles that are quite credible threats in game. For this video, just as an excuse to talk through some strong rules, I thought we'd rank 8 of the strongest heavy armoured vehicles in Warhammer 40k right now. This one a bit of an arbitrary list based on my opinion. Obviously, they aren't really directly comparable, they do different things in different armies, but just as a very rough gauge of power within the game right now. For the sake of variety, I thought we'd do a maximum of 1 per faction, although we'll touch on a fair few of the ones that I've marked as runners-up going along. And within 40k itself, tank is maybe just a little bit of a hard thing to define. Different races have all sorts of different flavours of armoured vehicles, some heavier than others. For this one I tried to go with anything that I think would have had the tank keyword in prior 40k editions, so things like Tyranid monstrous creatures, Space Marine dreadnoughts, Imperial Knight armigers, they're all not going to be included for this one. And while many dedicated transport vehicles might be considered tanks, things like Rhinos or Sisters Immolators for example, I thought we'd keep the focus on the mainline battle tanks in this one. Things that have a fair bit of threat, even if they do have a bit of transport capacity. So again, everything in the dedicated transport slot is going to be excluded for the purposes of this video. All that being said, let's jump into it. Let's go through a few honourable mentions, then get into the top 8. First up, I thought we'd just do a very quick roundup of the factions that do have tanks, but I felt maybe were just a little bit more underwhelming compared with most other things in game at the moment, their armour not being particularly strong highlights of their codex. Space Marine non-core armour has really struggled ever since their new codex, and even repeated points drops to things like Land Raiders, Gladiators, and Predator tanks don't seem to have been enough to encourage people to play them regularly. If I had to give one tank the prize of best tank in 40k, I might go for the Gladiator Reaper. I have seen them turn up every so often in competitive lists, particularly for Iron Hands, and they do spam out a whole ton of volume fire with those twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannons, plus those Tempest bolters. They're at least reasonably fast and reasonably tough with Armour of Contempt and Toughness 8, and I feel like are one of the better picks for armoured vehicles within the codex outside Dreadnoughts. Otherwise, perhaps I might be tempted to actually rank the Space Marine Astrius kind of high. That's the enormous Primaris super heavy tank. Again, every so often someone seems to do well with one of those at a tournament, just because it's an enormous flying threat that's very hard to take out with a 2+ armor save plus Armour of Contempt. And with Space Marine armor being what it is otherwise, it might well be in with a shot of the top spot as well. Moving on, we've got the Sisters, who really just have the 2 options outside the Immolator, which is their transport, and they are the Castigator and the Exorcist. Out of the 2, I'd give it to the Castigator. 3 heavy bolters, plus a great big turret-mounted main cannon. They're not too bad sat in the backfield, just for a little bit of reliable volume fire at OK range, but most people seem to get their big firepower from things like Retributors or even Paragon Warsuits. The multi-melters with the core buffs that you can put on them are pretty nice. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, I'd rate the Onager Dunecrawler as perhaps the strongest at the moment. Again, it's kind of a 2-horse race for the Mechanicus. It's Onager Dunecrawler versus Scorpius Disintegrator, and I would count the Onager Dunecrawler as a tank. People do seem to refer to it every so often as a crab tank or a spider tank. I'd say that both options are far behind the core Iron Striders with their great big Cognis las cannons. I'd probably slightly give it to the Onager Dunecrawler with the neutron laser for a bit of dedicated backfield anti-tank, but the slightly pricier Scorpius Disintegrator isn't terrible either. For the Chaos Space Marines, the focus really seems to be very much for the melee troops as opposed to the armoured vehicles, and the Demon Engines sort of feel like a thing that's almost a tank but maybe not quite. I'd say probably if you were counting Demon Engines as tanks, then maybe the Venom Crawler might take it. That's got a bunch of damage 2 attacks which are quite good at killing elite infantry, plus help out your psychic and all for fairly cheap. Otherwise though, for proper tracked vehicles, I'd probably give it to the Chaos Vindicator. This one got really quite a nice set of improvements in the latest codex. AP-4 and D3+3 shots on the main gun, making it a lot less swingy and unreliable, plus it's pretty tanky for the cost as well at Toughness 8 and a 2+ save. Not too terrible for the Iron Warriors, who also have a fairly decent stratagem for it. Finally, for the Necrons, again it's maybe more of a question as to what you define as a tank. Perhaps their closest equivalents would be things like the Doomsday Ark and the Monolith, both of which I think are kind of okay and fairly similar in power. The Doomsday Ark does just seem to be a little bit better than the Doomstalker, at least in raw numbers, and comes with a whole battery of Gauss flares to back up the main gun. Not being able to move and shoot, though, is a serious downside. I think the Monolith isn't quite as far behind as it used to be as well, gaining core and dropping a whole bunch of points. Still not one of the top picks for Necron armies, but a few armies might struggle to deal with them a bit more than you might expect. They are fairly tanky and spit out a reasonable amount of ranged fire, plus a little bit of a surprise melee with the portal. Moving on though, let's get into the top 8 in earnest, things that actually do turn up in competitive lists for their factions at least semi-regularly. In 8th place I've chosen to rank the Goliath Rockgrinder of the Genestealer cult, basically a big heavy armoured truck mounting a fearsome drill dozer blade and packing some heavy firepower and a small transport capacity. As heavy vehicles go, it's a rather cheap one at just 110 points, and for the cost I think the defensive profile isn't too bad. 10 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save is fairly mediocre, but a -1 damage really keeps it safe against things like damage 2 weapons. For its armament, I'd be most tempted by either the heavy seismic cannon or the mining laser, maybe slightly coming down on the seismic cannon side of things, 3 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3, or switching out for 6 shots at strength 6 and damage 2 if you want to shoot some infantry. You can take a cache of demolition charges to allow your friendly embarked mutants to throw some bombs out the windows, and also allow a nice auto-explode stratagem, not too bad on an expendable vehicle. And of course if the enemy does get too close, in combat it's fairly fearsome. 8 attacks on the charge with a drill dozer blade, all hitting on 3s, at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2. Generally speaking, I think Genestealer cults will typically be wanting to move this up the board with a squad embarked, maybe have the squad jump out and maul something in combat, or do actions on objectives and things. And in general, the opponent will have to try and focus this down quite quickly, otherwise it's going to cause some problems. The firepower isn't terrible, and the melee is actually fairly threatening to quite a lot of units, plus it's got the potential to get crossfire, and the auto-explosion can be pretty powerful as well. Moving on, and sticking with the Xenos, in 7th place I've ranked the Eldar Falcon Grav tank. 145 points base for a tank that can fall out the sky, hit you with some heavy firepower, and also deliver a squad to shoot. The primary weapon that it sports is the pulse laser, 2 shots at strength 9, AP -3 and damage D3+3. Pretty solid there, and will certainly like craft worlds like Ulthway where you get a single reroll. Besides that, it gets either a shuriken cannon or catapults mounted under slung, plus another one of your choice of the Eldar heavy weapons, though you do have to pay if you want to upgrade to it. Toughness wise, it's not really anything to write home about, fairly fragile at 12 wounds, toughness 7 and a 3+ save, but I feel like the toughness is made up for a bit by its Cloud Strike rule, meaning that you can basically drop down like a drop pod turn 1, fire off all your guns with presumably a very good line of sight, and then even transport something like a fragile aspect warrior squad into battle, and they can jump out of the back hatch and light the enemy up with a whole bunch of shuriken fire, or perhaps even some fire dragons with their fusion guns. I have seen some competitive Eldar lists go very big on these, taking 3 of them, all with some scary embarked units, and hopefully cripple the enemy before they get a chance to strike back properly. Otherwise in the codex though, I might have been quite tempted to rank the Fire Prism top as well. I think that one's also interesting, and a common thing that people like to do with them is have 2 of them, use the linked fire to ignore the invul saves, and then just have one of them scoot out of cover and then back in with some vectored engines so they can move, shoot, move, and hit the enemy while not being hit at least for a couple of turns. I feel like you are paying a big premium for that, but provided you've got a scary enemy tank to take aim at, then you almost guarantee a pretty crazy amount of damage on your chosen target. Moving on, for Orky armor, I think it kind of depends as to whether or not you count the kill rig as a tank. I feel like for this one I am going to rank it as one, even if it is a bit unorthodox. It is a big heavy armoured vehicle in the heavy support section, whose main purpose is dealing a bunch of damage, even if it's a bit of a beast snagger type interpretation of the concept. The kill rig costs 190 points base, and I feel like every time I talk about this thing, it's just got a whole load of threats that it brings to the table, plus reasonable movement, toughness, transport, and some stratagem support. For its main weapons, perhaps the scariest thing is the Whir Tower. If you manage to cast a psychic power with the embarked Whir Boy, then you get D3 auto hits on your target with strength 9, AP 3 and damage D6, surprisingly reliable for orcs. Otherwise it's got a sticker cannon with a rocket type profile that gets to reroll hit rolls against heavies, plus an stratagem option for locking them near to the vehicle, and an heavy lobber barrage weapon that could be useful for whittling down the last vestiges of a squad or something, but perhaps is mainly handy for its stratagem to slow down a unit and hopefully keep something key out of the game for a bit. Then when it charges in, it causes a fair amount of carnage as well, A big 14 attacks in melee with a combination of saws, horns, and the butcher boys embarked on the sides. It certainly quite likes to be goths, amping up the power of those attacks and giving them some more hits. Otherwise, as mentioned, it is a psyker and a character as well. Frazzle can be quite a good one, as it can push out a whole bunch of mortal wounds off that big base, but even just smite can be useful too. It can threaten a fairly reliable first turn charge in some builds. Things like ramming speed, squig hide tires, or evil sons will all get it there a bit faster. It's already got a base movement of 12, and it can transport 10 beast snagger boys to the front as well, having them jump out to mess up enemy light infantry and take some objectives. Overall, generally fairly strong, and not too hard to see why a lot of the orc lists tend to build around them. Otherwise though, and I think at least fairly stiff competition for the title, is the trusty battle wagon, a very cheap and tough tracked vehicle that you can get for 120 points with a death roller. Another pretty solid way of getting a whole bunch of boys right to the front, and then can be a fairly nasty melee threat with the roller as well, at least for the fairly cheap points that it costs. Moving onwards, and in 5th place I've chosen to rank the Plagueburst Crawler of the Death Guard. These things have been pretty awesome basically all edition, and despite that have gone down in points a few times, though I guess the barrage nerf did hurt the mortar. Plagueburst Crawlers cost 145 points if you upgrade to the entropy cannons, which I would, and then that gives you a very sturdy chassis that packs a d6 shots with the Plagueburst mortar, strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, with indirect fire and plague weapon to reroll wound rolls of 1. It can also use that disgusting force stratagem for 1 CP. That one makes the mortar damage 3 if you're taking aim at 3 wound infantry, and also deals a bit of splash damage to any units clustered up nearby. Besides that, the entropy cannons are pretty effective as well. 2 shots on the sponsons, hitting on 3s at strength 8, AP 4 and damage D3 plus 3, again with plague weapon, plus a small amount of anti-infantry from the whole gun. Perhaps the most impressive thing about the Plagueburst Crawler is just how tough the thing is for the cost. 12 wounds at toughness 8 with a 3+ save is a fairly good start, but then also it has a 5+ invul, -1 damage, and also armour of contempt for dealing with AP -1 and 2 things. Often Death Guard lists tend to take 1 or 2 of these just to loiter around in the backfield, putting out a bit of quality anti-tank fire, and maybe using the mortar to try and pick off some enemy infantry squads or opportune targets that the enemy really wants to hide, and then maybe could be a little bit more aggressive later in the game and move up to put that tough profile on objectives. Moving on, and in 4th place we have the Caladius Grav tank, a tank that honestly I could have ranked a place or 2 higher. A great big Forge World Custodes tank that seems to appear in at least the majority of competitive Custodes lists at the moment, and often in multiples. The tank costs 205 points base, and it's a very fast tank with a couple of generalist weapons. For the main gun, you've got 2 profiles that I both think are very reasonable picks, either a twin Arachnus heavy blaze cannon. That one gets to choose its profile, either 2 anti-tank shots at strength 9, AP -4 and damage D3 plus 3, re-rolling wounds against vehicles, or an anti-infantry profile with 8 shots at strength 7 and damage 1. Otherwise you've got the more generalist Iliastus accelerator cannon, 60 inches and 8 shots at strength 7, AP -3 and damage 2, a little bit better at chewing through elite infantry. It also gets a Lastrum bolt carbine as well, 6 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1. Overall the guns have at least fairly decent range and are very general purpose. Most things that you shoot them at will generally not like it, and perhaps are particularly good for clearing out light infantry units that the Custodians don't really want to have to move all the way to get to grips with. Toughness wise, I'd say it's okay for the cost. 14 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save, but getting a 5+ invul. Perhaps its main advantage on that front is that it's got a reasonably long range, plus it's quite fast, so it should be able to gain line of sight on what it needs to, while also staying at least reasonably safe. In general, these things like to generally do that for the first few turns, stay safe in the backfield, and then again can use that great movement to go to objectives, or rush out to get key line of sight on things and chase down nuisance threats. I feel like particularly the Iliastus accelerator cannon is kind of made for gunning down light vehicles that are a bit too fast for the main Custodian's battle line to catch up with. Moving on, and next in 3rd place, I've chosen to rank the Tau Empire Hammerhead and Longstrike. 145 points base with a railgun for the Hammerhead. Longstrike is a bit more, up at 160. These things are certainly fairly terrifying threats to have on the other side of the table. An enormous solid shot from the railgun that can punch straight through invuls, and usually tends to land around about 11 wounds on its target if it successfully wounds with its strength 14 and AP -6 profile. On top of that, it also gets either smart missiles, a burst cannon, or cheap drones. I'd probably say it's usually worth upgrading to either the burst cannons or the smart missiles myself. Otherwise, for advantages of the tank, it can easily pick up a 3+ to hit with marker lights. It's got an inbuilt reroll to hit with its targeting relay, plus it can easily pick up a reroll to wound as well for Tau Sept or the Farside Enclaves. With the mortal wounds, it's far from useless even against heavy infantry targets, and can trade out to the submunition stratagem if you do want to really put some hurt on hordes. If you're playing Tau Sept, then I'd treat Longstrike as the first go-to. He's got a base ballistic skill upgrade to hit on 3+ innately, and for just 15 points that's more than worth it. In general, these guys really like to gun down the biggest and nastiest hard targets around. In games when you're playing against things like knights or other heavily armoured vehicles, they're going to be fairly monstrous, though I would bear in mind that they aren't without their downsides. They're not exactly all that hard to kill themselves for the cost either, with only toughness 7 and no invul save. I do think that they're fairly scary, and have ranked them fairly high on the list, but I would bear in mind that often Tau players just often choose to take other things besides the Hammerhead. In recent successful lists in Nephilim, it seems more common that people will be picking up things like Riptides, Sunshark Bombers, and of course the ever-dependable Crisis Suits, all of which seem to see a little bit more play than the mighty Hammerhead, despite that scary railgun profile. Still though, despite that, very intimidating to see them on the other side of the table if you've got just about any heavy units yourself. Moving on, and in second place I've chosen to rank the mighty Votann Hecaton Land Fortress, even with its new and fairly chunky cost of 300 points. Despite all the points nerfs, Votann still seems to be doing pretty well, and Hecaton Land Fortresses seem to be appearing in at least a fair few of the top performing Votann lists, perhaps kind of showing just how utterly ridiculous they were when they were around about 230 points. Typically the primary weapons I think are a bit more balanced now than when the Magna Rail Cannon had the very easy access to the splash damage. It actually seems that in more competitive lists, people tend to be taking that SP Heavy Conversion Beamer over the scary Rail Cannon, though both still seem to be making big appearances. The SP Heavy Conversion Beamer is admittedly a very scary gun, a 30-inch range Hunter 2 weapon with Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 4, and every time you hit something that's greater than 15 inches away, each successful hit roll gains you an extra hit, so the actual damage output is more akin to firing 4 shots rather than 2. If you can manage to skewer multiple enemy units with that very scary profile, they're going to be in for a really bad time. Never mind if you actually use any of the other beam weapon stratagems available for a little bit more damage. Otherwise, that Magna Rail Cannon still is very nice, a single shot at strength 14, AP 4 and damage 2d3 plus 6. It ignores invul saves, so again it's just a gun that can just blast circum vehicles straight off the table, no questions asked. And they've even got that Hunter's Mark stratagem to guarantee an auto hit if you want to invest the command point early. It can even still do the automatic splash damage combo if you wanted to, paired with Uthar the Destined from the Great Arthurian League. Make the thing auto hit with the Hunter's Mark stratagem, and then have Uthar automatically guarantee the 6 to wound, triggering the splash damage and potentially vaporizing most squads in the game off the board in a single blast. Besides one of those very scary guns, it also has the Matter Autocannon, 6 shots at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, and then secondary weapons in either ion beamers or bolt cannons, both of which are pretty sufficiently scary. They all ignore light cover typically with that pan-spectral scanner, and also means that this thing can be the ultimate area denial with its Auspex scans type stratagem. And of course, any damage output can be greatly magnified by judgment tokens, and the 1 CP thing to allow it to reroll all hit rolls if it does target a unit that has a judgment token. Defense-wise, this thing is no slouch either, at 16 wounds at toughness 8 with a 2+ save plus void armor, and certain leagues can make it considerably tougher than this even. Say getting toughness 9 in the Irani Surta regulates, or 4+ invul with Kronos plus the better range on the guns. Otherwise it got a little bit of transport capacity. You could hide a squad of scary berserks in it to jump out and maul the enemy if they get close. And finally, if you were say taking 2 of these things, they're very easily supported by a Brockhere Forge Master. Give him his Warlord trait and he'll be repairing an average of 4 wounds a turn on them, making 1 hit on a 2+, and even negating a big damage shot that comes in on them once per turn, potentially making something big like a melter wound on 1 disappear once you fail the save. Overall very intimidating. They still don't seem to be utterly auto-included for the Votann or anything, but they are very strong. Finally, and for the choice that I've chosen to rank first on the list, I would currently rate the Astra Militarum Leman Russ battle tank as the single strongest tank in 40k right now, with its fearsome new profile. I've done a full and fairly extensive unit review video for the Leman Russ tank recently, so feel free to check that out after this. But broadly speaking, a typical loadout could be 165 points when you've paid for the whole weapon and some heavy bolter sponsons, or 175 points if you make them a tank commander HQ. For the primary weapon, the choices that I'd be most tempted to take between would likely be the Executioner Plasma Cannon if you're uncertain, with other contenders maybe being the Vanquisher and Gatekeeper. The Executioner cannon is 36-inch range and gets an average of 6 or 7 shots, strength 8, AP -4, and a big damage 3 when overcharged. It will likely do a little bit of damage to the tank, but that's a really scary generalist profile that evaporates things like Terminators and armoured vehicles almost alike, and against lighter things you can just not overcharge and then save yourself a bit of damage. The Vanquisher cannon's kind of similar to the railgun on the Hammerhead. A single shot at strength 14, AP 4, damage D3 plus 6, plus an extra D3 mortal wounds, ignoring invul saves, and perhaps being particularly nice if you have the single reroll regimental doctrine going, or if you buy it in on a tank commander. Pretty scary stuff whenever you convert one of these hits, particularly against something like Imperial Knights. Finally, Gatekeeper, the relic battle cannon that you can take on tank commanders, I think is definitely worth a mention. It averages far more hits at an average of 8 shots, and then it gets strength 9, AP 3, and damage 3. It's basically flatly superior to the other turrets against the vast majority of targets, and unlike the Executioner has a better range and doesn't deal mortal wounds to yourself. You get all of that on top of the whole las cannon and some sponson heavy bolters, though you could swap them out for some heavy flamers if you want the tank to play a bit more aggressively. Damage wise, most of the weapons will be hitting on 4s, though the primary weapon will be hitting on a 3+ with a turret weapon keyword. Really nice for the reliability. Plus, turret weapon also prevents you from being locked up too badly in combat, and you can still fire out against other targets even if you get tagged. A really big deal. On top of that, a lot of guard armies at the moment are using the Born Soldiers regimental doctrine, though other decent ones exist. 6s to hit auto wounding on the tank most of the time is actually really helpful for the heavy bolters. It certainly doesn't hurt when you get them on the main primary weapon though. Durability wise, the tank's 13 wounds at toughness 8 and a 2+ save. Very respectable, even though it's rumoured to be losing Armour of Contempt in the next balanced data slate. To be honest, I really feel that Armour of Contempt isn't exactly something that the tank needs when it's got this kind of profile. Otherwise, added to all this good stuff, you also have some very flexible tank orders from a nearby friendly tank commander or Lord Solar or something. They can mean that you get extra speed, such as getting a bonus to movement and advancing and still shooting. That could get you line of sight on key things. Objective secured if it matters, particularly with the tanks being able to play a bit more aggressive with that turret weapon rule, and potentially just more damage with reroll 1s to hit, particularly handy for that Executioner plasma cannon, as then you won't be taking anywhere near as many mortal wounds. Finally, you do also have the tank case upgrades. I feel like they're a little bit more take or leave to be honest, but certainly for the Vanquisher cannon you can potentially buy in the one that allows you to reroll 1 failed hit roll. Very big when you're using it with a profile that's going to average 10 damage if you convert it. Overall, I do feel that currently the Leman Russ is probably the most fearsome tank in all of Warhammer 40k. Unlike just about anything else on this list, it's pretty viable to run entire squadrons of them as a competitive army with just a few things supporting. The raw crazy damage output that they can kick out is pretty spectacular, and they've got the speed to get line of sight on the things that they most need to. I guess for rivals within the Guard Codex, there are a few other solid options. The Rogue or Dawn I think isn't too far behind numbers wise, and you could have one or more to support the Russes. I feel like the Hydra is also very solid for the cost. Even when not pointing against aircraft, the profile is still pretty threatening. And if you're counting artillery type vehicles, then the Death Strike missile is pretty brutal, perhaps more so as an area denial tool and stopping the enemy from hiding behind certain terrain bits more than anything else. So with the Mighty Leman Russ discussed, I think we'll leave that there for Warhammer 40k armour. As always, let me know your thoughts on the video down in the comments below. Would you have ranked these the same way, or are there any that you think are a little bit underrated or overvalued? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. If you'd like something else done in a similar sort of style to watch, I'll leave a link to my top 10 weakest armies in Warhammer 40k video down in the video description below. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can also find that one linked down in the video description as well. The channel's Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.